International Fund for Ireland and other peace-building entities, Avila's deep experience is in the work of civil society and Northern Ireland's Women's Coalition. She served as the director of the Community Foundation for Northern Ireland from 1994 and from 1994 to 2014, 10 years. No, 20 years, sorry, that's my maths is showing. And can talk about the role of civil society in the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Carlos to open this session.
Thank you. Is it working? Yes, it does. Okay. Thanks to Yale University for the opportunity to discuss the implementation of the peace agreement. Claire advanced my line, but I didn't know whether Sergio will agree that implementation can be as difficult as reaching an agreement, but at least sometimes it is. It's really a pleasure to see so many Colombian friends, which are really the protagonists of this story in the search for peace for their country. Now, this is a process where the UN, is very much invested in. The UN is invested in basically out of the conviction that this is the right path for Colombia, but also that Colombia's success can really help and inspire peacemaking and peace building elsewhere. Also, this is a very timely moment to do this exercise, not only because of the comparisons that we can draw, the lessons learned that we can draw from one process to the other, but what we can actually draw, hopefully, to other situations around the world, as was mentioned from the beginning. And in the case of Colombian context, because we are in the 1/3 of the 15-year ambition timetable, and in a few months, a new administration will take office and in all likelihood will continue to implement. Focusing on implementation, I think the best way to do it is by flagging, from my perspective, the areas that are going well, that are really making important progress, the areas that are not working well or more needs to be done, or some things differently even, and then hopefully trying to add some elements to a building kit for lessons learned for the implementation part that probably can help constructing and building the lessons learned. What's going right? Well, evidently the laying down of the weapons process was done, I think, not only in a very expeditious way, but also according to the UN standards in terms of the weapons vis-a-vis ex-combatants, was done really, I would say, in a fantastic way. Now, sometimes we forget the importance of, and we forget out of the normalcy that we see these days of FARC participating in politics. I think that this is an important aspect. The political reintegration of the former guerrilla, working day by day in producing initiatives, in really being part of the democratic landscape of Colombia, it's something to cherish. The fact that the vast majority of the 13,000 former combatants are still committed to the process, despite the uncertainties, despite the challenges that they face every day in terms of security and other challenges. The fact that the conflict-related violence has reduced dramatically. Overall numbers, average numbers. Evidently, we have some challenges in certain regions that we are experiencing resurgence of violence. And I'll mention those in a minute. The socioeconomic reintegration of former combatants has progressed also in an important way. We have around 60%, more than 60% of ex-combatants being linked to an income-generating activities, to productive projects. Now, in these areas where we start to see certain areas where there's been a prioritization in terms of areas of implementation, like the reintegration process, it's an area where also the bodies that were built in the agreement, such as the National Reintegration Council, is those bodies that are working well in terms of cooperation between the parties. And I'll probably go back in a minute to those institutions that were built in the agreement and how they are working. The investments in the conflict-affected areas that were mentioned, that's the part of the rural reform that is working best, or is working a bit more than others in terms of what is called the local development programs, the PEDETs. That is also an important element that is moving in the right direction. The impact that the agreement has had in deepening democracy in the country. We have seen in the last congressional election, the two last congressional elections have been by and large peaceful, participatory, inclusive. A number of women has increased in participating in politics, candidates and elected women to Congress. The new 16 seats for victims, for the conflict-affected areas have been established and have been elected. The innovative system of transitional justice, also it's a we have to recognize the progress that has been made by the three entities, notably the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, and obviously the message that it sends about that the peace should can be established, or can be achieved, not at the expense of justice. And within that, the element of recognition, of the acknowledgement of crimes, of war crimes committed by former commanders of the guerrilla. That is really an historical achievement. Just a few years after they lay down the weapons, they are willing to recognize this. Probably it's for the scholars to determine what is the interplay between the institutional design and the individual behavior in terms of this recognition. But it's something really to recognize. Now, there are two important actors that also play an important role. One is civil society, coming to probably to those actors at the bottom or at the top that have made a positive contribution. One, civil society of Colombia, from the beginning, from the process as such, to this day, in terms of implementing the agreement, on the pressure, the constructive pressure they make in terms of the implementation. I think it's something also to acknowledge. And the other one, the international community. Obviously, as I mentioned, the UN is clearly invested, but it's not only the UN, it's really those countries, guarantor countries, different countries represented in Colombia that are all the time making important contributions to the process in terms of political support, technical support, and financial support to the process. Now, in terms of what is not working or should be working better, clearly the issue of security. I mean, insecurity is really the biggest threat to peace and to peace in Colombia. One aspect is the failure to fill the vacuum that FARC left when they demobilized. There's been explanations that this agreement was only with FARC, not with the other groups. It is partially true, because the expectation was as the state was to fill those gaps left by the former guerrilla, and the lack of filling those gaps to the extent that was envisioned is that, and those gaps being filled by the other illegal armed groups or organized crime in those regions, have meant that the positive experience of reduction of violence of those communities living in those areas now it's experiencing the opposite experience. They are basically under threats and being confined or being displaced because of the presence or the battles of over control of the territory or over control of the illicit economies in those areas. Obviously, the human toll in terms of insecurity, we have had more than 300 ex-combatants being killed, hundreds of social leaders and human rights defenders being killed in those same regions. And that clearly affects them, their families, and in general, the communities, and obviously the environment and the aspirations of those that live in those areas. Still, there's a window of opportunity, and but this will require different actions really to shift this important aspect of the implementation. Evidently, more holistic interventions are expected and are pushed by different actors in terms of public forces, but also civilian institutions, social services that need to come to those areas. There's a need for further investments in those areas. With the risk, a cliche, we need a Marshall Plan for the rural Colombia. Security former combatants need to be strengthened, and overall, we are still also. And it was mentioned before by Professor Wood in terms of those transformational elements of the agreement that are still not experiencing also the level of implementation that is needed. Rural reform, political reform, the crop substitution program needs also further efforts. The other element that I will mention, and evidently the gender and ethnic chapter also needs to be implemented, is reconciliation. At the end, the Secretary General in his visit to Colombia made an important point to say that in any democracy, you can disagree about every issue, but that peace should not be one of those issues in Colombia anymore. And that, and Sergio mentioned it in the morning, the fact we have some progress in that area. I mean, the fact that there's additional support for the peace agreement around the country is a positive element. The fact that all candidates, leading candidates, have expressed that they will implement, or they committed to implement the agreement, is also positive. No to reopen discussions, and was the situation in the past 4 years ago is positive. Still, reconciliation remains incipient. And one of the elements that we should emphasize is about the words of peace, the gestures of peace, because besides what is being implemented by the different actors, including in particular the government, we're still missing the software of peace. Our friend Eamon Gilmore, that was mentioned in the morning as well, used to say that the authorities, one of the biggest assets they have is the biggest microphones around the country. So they should use those microphones in the right way. So if they continue to stigmatize or they continue to divide, that will not help the reconciliation process. Besides the hardware, besides the institutions, besides the programs, besides all the elements that we have or that Colombians have agreed in the agreement. The other is the second point is to use fuller use of the mechanisms and the institutions devised in the agreement. We have many bodies that are for the parties to continue to supervise and continue to monitor implementation and to sort out obstacles, to sort out solutions, and is not being used to the fuller extent. We hope that the new government, the new authorities, will use those bodies in the right direction. And well, thirdly, obviously, the support that the transitional justice system still requires. The special jurisdiction for peace that is moving really forward, and the cases will be sanctioned soon. And with those cases being sanctioned soon, again, the risk of further divisions on the society again around the transitional justice could emerge in terms of a system that is built around impunity and all those calls that we have experienced in the past. The Truth Commission will issue its final report in the coming weeks, and they will reveal truths that could be harmful, that could be, I mean, not harmful, but rather could be hard for the society to listen again, to open wounds or reopen wounds. But it's important for the society really to treat the recommendation with wisdom, and it's important for the international community to continue supporting those institutions. So just to finalize, just a couple of points. The one that I want to really flag is the role that the institutional design of the agreement as an element important influencing a positive or a negative result in terms of implementation. I think that there was a really important decision to bring this armor around the agreement, to bring this, to level up the agreement at the constitutional level was important to protect and to give stability to the implementation. To establish this all these bodies to supervise and to have the parties interacting in terms of trying to solve the problems was an important design also in the peace agreement that should be also flagged. And coming back to the sandwich of Sergio in the morning, the role of civil society, the role of the local communities in terms of really supporting the agreement at the local level, at the support level is important, as well as the role in this case of the international community to maintain their support to Colombia. I take this advantage to emphasize the important role of the international community. We know the international community have different priorities, have evolve over time, but it's important for the international community to not to move on prematurely from Colombia. We still need all the support, national and international, in terms of the peace process in Colombia, in order to maintain it as a success story, to maintain a success story as along with the Northern Ireland example, so we can hopefully have this as a good example going forward for our own processes, but also to new processes around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Testing times coming up for implementation of Colombia's peace agreement. Should I pass over to Jessica Faieta, who has also deep experience working on all of those aspects of implementation of the peace agreement?
Thank you, Claire, and thank you again for to the Peace and Development Program for having invited me after I have spent 4 years in Colombia. This is really a privilege for me to be here in Yale and be able to talk about this, and actually had the last 6 months to reflect a little bit about it. So I hope to be a little bit objective. However, it's hard having been there. Just to give you a sense of what was the division of work. So we had the UN verification mission that they're established by the Security Council, the international community, to verify the implementation. Was part of the agreement. And then it was the UN system with other parts of the international community, as Carlos mentioned, who were there committed with our programs, with funding, with personnel, with experts to support the implementation, to accompany the implementation. And it was really what I devoted the last 4 years. We were the largest presence of the UN, larger than in many places. Altogether, including the mission, we were 3,300 people there. The large majority Colombians that were there. And we supported from anything from the establishment, for instance, of the integrated system. So literally to have the HEP, the Truth Commission, the unit for the search of disappeared people, to actually become institutions from scratch. These were institutions that did not exist. So that was part of our work there. The reincorporation of ex-combatants. I was there for the establishment for the deployment of the teams in the mission, and these were 45 teams in the most remote places of Colombia. There were at the same time more than 30 spaces where the ex-combatants had congregated, and they were actually, that's where the reincorporation was taking place. So that alone was a challenge for us. And of course, we were also supporting the reparation of victims, which was an important part of the implementation, and accompanying in most of the financing, the development, the implementation of the local development plans that Carlos talked about. We established a multi-partner trust fund that by the time I left had implemented $200 million for these elements. $200 million in a country like Colombia, that is a high middle income country where seldom is a lot of money. But in parallel to this multi-partner trust fund, there was funds from the European Union and a fund for the international finance institutions. So it was actually a lot of work. So the role of the UN system, not only of the UN system and the international community, not only in supporting and embracing this peace process, but in accompanying the implementation and financing the implementation was very much, because in a way the financing also served as to leverage the goodwill that sometimes was not that good on the part of the government, and push, especially, and also to complement, for instance, the work of the integral system for truth and justice. In the implementation, I wanted to make reference to a very recent survey that UNDP and the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, PRIO, with the Universidad de los Andes did on the perceptions of the peace process in the conflict-affected territories. And at the end of the day, my work and my career in the UN has been mostly in development. And therefore, for us and for me, the most important measure ultimately is how this process changed the life of people and how people perceive this process. So we undertook this survey, which was a very rigorous 12,000 people from the most remote areas in Colombia, both in the villages and in the rural of the rural area, so really remote places. And we found that there was actually a lot of hope, but also a lot of challenges in how people refer. The good thing is that we did this in two moments: in 2019, where we established the baseline, and in 2021. And we saw that close to half of the people, and this was already a tendency upwards, supported the peace process in general, supported. So that's a lot. You would say, why 48% is not a lot, but that's a lot of people that supported in those territories. But that it was also a lot of challenges when you actually went through the implementation of the different components of this peace agreement. There was a very mixed and a lot less support, because people saw it differently depending on how they sat. For instance, people valued very much the situation, the development plan, the local development plan, the rural development plans. This is an essence of the root causes of this conflict, of why you have more than a third of the territory of Colombia, where 6 million people live, so different and so left behind. So of course, they had a lot of hope and that this will be transformational. At the same time, people perceived as, well, but we haven't really seen it yet. So they're hoping for it to be good, but they haven't seen as much as goods and services actually come to the territory. People valued enormously the process of illicit crop substitution, for instance, but valued the concept, the tool, but at the same time, because of the secure situation that many people witnessed in their territories, they didn't think that it was going well, although they wished that it was a good idea, let's say, but it wasn't really going great. And of course, the process of reincorporation also was something that people valued a lot, but there persists an enormous amount of distrust in FARC ex-combatants. Very few people, for instance, will hire an ex-combatant. So that perception, that our conclusion was that the reincorporation of ex-combatants to civilian life had to come accompanied by reconciliation processes that actually built trust. And even though there's close to, depending, these are official figures, about 10,000 of the 13,000 that lay down their arms, about 10,000 people are in some sort of productive project. We also had some things that were not thought through at the beginning. I were imagining in the process, or not in detail. For instance, in the case of women, for the reincorporation of women, which accounted for about a fourth of the ex-combatants. And that goes also to the capacities of ex-combatants. We thought that, okay, so if everybody is attached to some sort of productive project, either farming or a small business or something, that would be seen. We realized that it was not that easy to transfer competencies that ex-combatants had as soldiers, let's say, to transfer it, or leadership to transfer to become a small farmer or a baker or I don't know, of a seamstress or something. It was not that easy. So to work on the personal competencies was very important. And women, for instance, many of them didn't have the aspiration to have a small business or to be part of a chicken farm. Their aspiration was to be mothers, to be parents, to have a family. And we saw that in the first few months of the reincorporation, that we had a baby boom, and then we had not thought of that. So we had to basically support and mobilize more funds to have daycare centers and other things, because to support and this was for the government a big challenge also, but that we worked together on this, was to also support women, but also many of the ex-combatants, to find a path in their life that was not, that sometimes we thought it was, just to give them some sort of. I just want to end with this. There was also in this concept of, in this survey about their future, right? And because there is of course, after the COVID, they saw a deterioration. Many people in these territories that already left behind, they saw a deterioration in their economies. When they were asked what is their aspiration to see a peace process, their aspiration was to see more health, more education, more roads in these territories. Even more than security, or even more than just to see the public forces. So in general, I think it was that peace is seen as integral part of the implementation for people to actually see progress in the peace.
Thank you very much. I have to say, I love the idea of a baby boom being one of the unexpected dividends of peace. Yeah. But that was a very human take on the reality of peace agreements being essentially there to serve the populations who have been suffering. We tend to forget sometimes. Can we move on now to the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement? And Fergal. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Claire. And firstly, just thank Bonnie and here for the invitation. It's great to be here. And also thank you all for coming back after lunch. I was always afraid when we're on the lunchtime shift that people don't come back. So it's great to see you all and to speak about the Northern Ireland peace process and the implementation phase. Maybe just to explain my own career, I started in 1990 in the Department of Foreign Affairs. I started work with the International Fund for Ireland, so very much on the reconciliation side of work in Northern Ireland. And then I went off and did some other work and came back in 1999. And since then, I've spent an awful lot of my career on implementation phase work. And it's really, really tricky, and it's hard, and it's hugely rewarding, and it's hugely important. I always think Rory got the easy end of the stick with the negotiation phase. The implementation phase is a lot harder. And it's a truism to say that peace is a process, not an event, but it's really, really true. Again, Rory spoke earlier on of the deep, deep roots of the peace process, going back to Sunningdale and then on into the 1980s, ramped up into the 1990s, down into declarations, ceasefires, huge work at civic society level, leading to that moment on the 10th of April 1998. And I remember one participant coming out and saying, she emerged into the light, of Good Friday morning with such hope in her heart. And yet the implementation phase was long and difficult and very, very challenging. And yet, you know, it delivered. And I think that's important. It has delivered for Northern Ireland. So in a sense, the Good Friday Agreement was the foundation stone upon which that transformation process was built. I look back now, you know, and I see two distinct implementation phases, 1998, 2007, and then from 2007 onward, right up to the present day. And I'll explain that. 1998, the Good Friday Agreement was signed. The referendums in both parts of the island were passed. I think 72% in Northern Ireland, 94% in the south, and then 85% on the island of Ireland. And that was very, very important. It gave it a legitimacy that I think has protected it through all the turbulence that came afterwards. But then we got into two distinct processes. One was the implementation phase of all the commitments in the Good Friday Agreement that haven't been fleshed out. And if you look at this document, it's 35 pages. That's what it is. This document here, it's a book we commissioned. It's all the agreements between the two governments regarding the peace process from Sunningdale right through to 2020 when we had the New Decade New Deal, a New Decade New Approach deal. And in this book, the Good Friday Agreement is 1998. There's 29 subsequent agreements after the Good Friday Agreement, 29. They're not agreements that superseded or undermined the agreement of 1998. They're all GFA compliant and they build on the work of that. But it just shows the process of implementation is challenging. And among those 29 documents and agreements and memorandums of understanding, some are absolutely derived from the Good Friday Agreement. Good Friday Agreement, 35 pages, comprehensive in its subjects and themes and commitments, but not much detail. So we had a policing commission, a criminal justice review. There was the process to identify and establish the North-South bodies, establish the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, the Equality Commission. All that flowed from the Good Friday Agreement and took a number of years. And that was really positive and transformational. And, you know, when I think back to that period working in that arena, Jonathan, you were mired in political problems around decommissioning and instability. In the other part of the forest, we were working away, implementing, and there was just energy around it. It was a really, really hopeful time. The two governments were working so well together, the political parties, the energy, civic society, ideas. It was extraordinarily positive. And yet, in another part of the landscape, there was the political instability around decommissioning, the lack of trust, and also tripping up where that lovely constructive ambiguity served so well on the 10th of April 1998 caused difficulty later on. A well-known Irish writer, Colm Tóibín, praised us for our great use of slippery words. And it's a great phrase, and there's great merit in slippery words on occasion, but it did cause difficulty in that period, 1998 through to 2006. You had multiple suspensions of the institutions, the Assembly, the Executive, the North-South Ministerial Council. You had political turbulence, particularly within unionism, but also on the national side. And the parties that, in a sense, led the peace process in the negotiations were superseded by other parties, particularly the DUP on the union side, which had not been part of the Good Friday Agreement negotiations. So there was that instability, and that's where, you know, the real commitment and dedication of the two governments led prime ministerial level was required, and where that ingenuity that you spoke about, Jonathan, was really required. Really clever use of language, really clever searching for solutions, ways to find agreement, to inject some momentum, to inject stability. I think at that point, Bertie Ahern spoke about spending 60 to 70 hours a week. That's our Prime Minister on this one issue alone in that period, 1998, 2000, 2001. Tony Blair, something similar. I think he recalled that no other British Prime Minister spent so much time on the Northern Ireland question, certainly not in 100 years. It was an extraordinary political and official and civic society engagement in the process to ensure that the peace process survived. But those two distinct processes of implementation, the the one that was catered for in the Good Friday Agreement, and then the kind of crisis management, they fed off each other, because as you implemented positive change, policing change, human rights architecture, north-south, people became more invested in the process. It was a virtual circle, as it were. And the more that changed, the more, I think, encouraged governments and people and parties to keep going. And yes, absolutely, with the commitment and support of the US administration and the US political system. But, it was political leaders ultimately who drove it, and ultimately delivered, I suppose, the key moment, which was the St. Andrews Agreement, which is the negotiations 2006, in a sense to square the final circle of the peace process, which was trust between the two now largest parties, Sinn Féin and the DUP, trust that the DUP were committed to power sharing, and trust that Sinn Féin were committed to the peace process, and all that entailed, including policing and signing up for policing, because policing is the manifestation of the state in your neighbourhood. And it was essential that all the parties in the executive would be committed to the new policing dispensation. So that's, there were many other issues, but they were two of the core issues at St. Andrews. And that led to buy-in by the DUP. It led to restoration of the institutions in May 2007. It was an extraordinary moment to see, Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern, but Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley together. I was there in Stormont. It had taken those years from 1998 to 2007 to get there, but it was an extraordinary moment and an extraordinary validation of the work of so many people. It wasn't easy, but it was seismic, and it did lead to 10 years of uninterrupted power sharing in Northern Ireland. Other issues came along then later on. I don't really want to stray too far into that just yet, but I think that was a key moment. The phase since then, I think, has been about consolidation and also tying up some loose ends. And when I say loose ends, I don't want to minimize what we're talking about here. We're talking about legacy. We're talking about residual paramilitarism, which is still in existence particularly in communities that maybe have felt left behind with the peace process, or haven't felt they've gained. I'm talking about Creggan and Derry, talking about parts of East Belfast. And so a lot of the work that went on, led by the two governments and the political parties, we had the Stormont House Agreement 2014, Fresh Start 2015, New Decade, New Approach in 2020, was that work of consolidating the implementation phase. Because we were dealing with maybe fewer issues, that's not to say that it was easier, because in some ways we found, throughout the process, that the wider the range of issues to be dealt with, the easier it was to find agreement and to gain progress, because everybody had some stake. Everybody could see they were getting something out of this. When the issues narrowed, it became more difficult. And I think that's a lesson, if we're into lesson sharing around peace process and implementation, is addressing a number of issues across the board can sometimes be easier than trying to solve one issue on its own. That can be quite difficult. And we found that in the New Decade, New Approach negotiations, which in a sense carried on from 2017 to 2020, because the issue there was, again, it was primarily about trust and lack of trust, and political relationships had faltered, but the issues were around Irish language, sustainability of the institutions. Nothing as difficult as what was dealt with in the Good Friday Agreement, prisoners, decommissioning, etc., policing, but because they were only few in number, they were actually quite difficult. But as I say, that's the process for us, the implementation phase, long, difficult, arduous, requiring ingenuity, but above all requiring political engagement and buy-in. There are also controversial issues. I mean, I speak about policing. And the policing reform, the Patent Commission, was an extraordinary piece of work, extraordinarily successful, but was difficult. It was difficult, as Ruiz said, because of different views of policing, Likewise, prisoners and prisoner releases. If you look at that from a point of view of reintegration, very, very successful. I think only 16 licenses were revoked out of 450 people released, but extremely hard for many, many people to see that. So again, implementation is difficult, hard, messy, you know, hard work, but it's worth doing. I will finish on an optimistic note. There's an election taking place, so I'm not going to comment on current issues at all. But there's an election taking place after 5 years in complete accordance with the Good Friday Agreement. It's a Good Friday Agreement election. Rory spoke earlier about changed landscape in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland looks and feels so different to 30 years ago. I didn't mention security normalization, demilitarization, taking down watchtowers, having, you know, police walking around the streets. It's extraordinarily different and extraordinarily successful despite the challenges. I'll finish because I'm going to have to finish, but I'll finish. I'm not going to do a Biden and quote Heaney poetry. But I will say I was up in the Heaney Museum in Balahi last summer, and so just a little note he had written. He was a great believer in words, and he had his own word hoard. But he wrote, "If we have the words, the chances are we'll find a way." And I guess this is what that means. This is what this has been about, the process, finding the words and the way through. And we'll keep on doing it. Okay.
Thank you very, very much, Fergal. I have to say 29 subsequent agreements to the Good Friday Agreement is terrifying food for thought, but it does actually really underline something that I think Sergio said earlier about the key ingredient for both agreements, but particularly implementation being political leadership. If you need the political leadership to see these things through, otherwise they can just collapse so quickly. So Avila Kilmurray, who can you hear us, Avila? You're still there?
Yes, I can. Yes,
Great.
thank you very much.
Who during all of those years that Fergal just outlined was a really, really difficult implementation effort, was working at the Community Foundation for Northern Ireland director and the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. So from a slightly different perspective, it'd be great to hear your thoughts as well.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, particularly to Bonnie and Hera. I'm sorry that I have to do it virtually. Ironically, actually, this morning, I was meeting with the Independent Reporting Commission on the disbandment of paramilitarism, which probably underlines the fact that we're still in implementation phase. Just in terms of what Jessica was saying and what we heard this morning, just to sort of reiterate, I think, the importance of the international perspective and the shared learning. And from our point of view, certainly, I mean, Niall talked about the importance of the political commitment in America. We also had, you know, and have long-term financial commitment to organizations like the International Fund for Ireland that has been working over a long period around peace building, and particularly the European Union, which has made amazing contribution over many years to peace building in Northern Ireland through both politically and through its peace programs. I've been working at community level in Northern Ireland since 1975, which gives you an idea of my vintage. Starting working with the Quakers on peace building, where to an extent, if I learned to trade at all, perhaps I learned my trade in the late 70s. And consequently, sort of, you know, I have a real sense of the importance of civil society in conflict situations. But just some reflections on the implementation of the agreement itself. And as you said, I was a founder member and a member of the negotiating team, a very small party, the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. We predated the UN 1325. So we had to get ourselves together and get elected, which we did in 6 weeks. Just reflecting on what was said this morning, fortunately or unfortunately, we had no men with guns. So we actually had to fight to get our voices heard. And I agree that with Fergal, I mean, I still think that the Good Friday Agreement, and it's got a lot of critiques at the moment, is a foundational document that actually was very effectively actually spoke to a range of views across our divided society. But there is a couple of major fault lines, I suppose, that we never got round to discussing properly. And probably, to be honest, because if we had started talking about them, we mightn't have gotten agreement, but has come back to haunt us. I mean, one is there was no much discussion or agreement about the nature of the conflict we were trying to fix. And that meant that, you know, you still had the official UK government narrative that Northern Ireland actually didn't have a war, it had an aggravated crime wave. And that then makes it quite difficult when you come to things like the definitions of victims and definitions of ex-prisoners. It creates, in some people's minds, a hierarchy of legitimate victims and complicit victims. So that, I think, remains as a big issue in terms of us trying to look at it at things like legacy. The second fault line we had, and actually it's a matter of interpretation of the agreement, because it's quite plain in the agreement that there is the possibility of a referendum on the future constitutional status of Northern Ireland. But some people, actually in the unionist community, would have seen the agreement as a line in the sand, as a settlement, and now let's go ahead and make Northern Ireland work. Other parties saw it as a process. And that still is an issue, I think, that bedevils the implementation of the agreement. And then we had, and I actually took Rory Montgomery's point this morning, and I remembered the chaos of the final days of actually putting the agreement to bed, basically. We have the sort of implicit sort of contradiction within the agreement that on the one hand, we were talking about, you know, sort of modification of democratic arrangements to ensure the essential cross-community consensus in terms of the governance in Northern Ireland. But then actually, when it comes to the referendum on the future of the constitutional status of this island, it is simple majoritarianism. And it is a sort of a bit of an either-or choice between unity of the island or continuation of union with Britain. Whereas, you know, actually, I suppose we should really have talked about, should we be talking about options like federal situations, confederation, different arrangements? Well, we actually never did that. We also had, and it was mentioned again this morning, you know, the sort of the creative ambiguity helped us get around and get around rather than over a number of very difficult situations. But the trouble with creative ambiguity is when you come to implementation, it then actually can be an issue in terms of people taking very different interpretations of what that actually meant. I suppose one of my reflections, and again, we just didn't look at it in enough detail, was actually looking at the process of implementation. I mean, to be quite honest, everybody was so elated and took such a sigh of relief whenever we got the document more or less across the line. And in fairness to David Trimble, that he stuck with that in terms of getting it across the line. Obviously, the Democratic Unionist Party was not there. But we didn't look at the implementation timetable, process. There was mention of a review, but a lot of the review of the agreement then became associated with crisis situations. So I think that was an issue. And, you know, I think Elizabeth mentioned this morning about the way the Kroc Institute is sort of monitoring the implementation of different aspects of the Colombian agreement. I mean, we didn't have that, and that I think was a mistake. And the fact that all those subsequent agreements that Fergal has referred to were necessary, and they were necessary, but because there was such an ongoing process of crisis negotiation, it started to leach the public confidence of the agreement. And I think that has been a problem. It has also given us a whole lot of agreements with clauses that haven't been implemented, which is frustrating to say the least. The other aspect, I think, looking at implementation and what we learned is there needs to be, and it's linked in with how you monitor the implementation, there needs to be a great clarity about who is responsible for doing what. So actually there's aspects of the Good Friday Agreement that the Irish and UK governments are clearly responsible for. There's aspects that were then brought back to Northern Ireland. And then there's the sort of hand down, hand off aspects that ended up with commissions, like the Patent Commission, or the working group that oversaw the early release of political prisoners. And one of the problems with that was that actually I would argue, and it's just personal sort of point of view, that, you know, the civil society organizations, and Martin Flaherty this morning mentioned the Committee Administration of Justice, CAJ, they had to really sort of act as a sort of really sort of a bulldog in terms of trying to ensure that the aspects of the Good Friday Agreement, particularly around the rights, responsibility and safeguards, were actually translated into UK government legislation, the sort of bills that were going through Parliament, through Westminster, to actually implement the agreement. And I remember a lot of time being spent in trying to change some of that wording, because some of our understanding of what the agreement was about were not being reflected in clauses of those bills. And the other thing that I think was problematic was that there was a bit of a shoveling off of responsibility for who was implementing what. Actually, we talked about the Bill of Rights this morning, that I think was a very important part of the Good Friday Agreement, because it also triggered a Charter of Rights for the whole island of Ireland, which again has not been addressed. That was the responsibility of the British government to implement it, but it was given back to our rather fraught Northern Ireland Assembly and has never been implemented. And that actually brings me on to another point. And I think that there's a real importance of, and Fergal and others have talked about the sense of support, elation, if you like, in the sort of 1998, 2000 period, when things were sort of seemed to be getting going. There's a real time element in implementation. And I think you implement your most sensitive issues quickly, while you actually have a sort of popular level of support. Because as time goes on, you get different political parties giving different interpretations. You get people that were children, in our case, during the peace process. And there's very easy sort of misreading or rereading of what was involved in the agreement, or what people expected. So I think you fast track what you can, and particularly perhaps some of the more difficult issues. Again, it was Women's Coalition actually that raised the issue of victims with the Good Friday Agreement, or it wouldn't have got in at all. If we had actually started work then, rather than sort of putting it off down the road. Somebody mentioned about kicking the can down the road. I mean, our roads are rattling. We've had so many cans kicked down it. So you actually really need to sort of to move when you can. And the other thing related to that is, there was a sense, and I can understand it. I mean, people were exhausted. There was a sense of, okay, we have to get the sort of constitutional assembly issues, the hard issues, in inverted commas, the decommissioning, the policing, sorted, and the soft issues will sort of look after themselves. Well, actually, I think there's some low-hanging fruit in some of those so-called soft issues. The soft issues in our situation were reinterpreted as community relations, reconciliation, socioeconomic conditions, involvement of women, victims' issues. Now, they actually didn't turn out to be soft issues. And, Roger McGinty talks about everyday peace indicators. Well, actually, some of those everyday peace indicators could have been wins and bought the confidence of communities that ended up, quite skeptical of some of the agreement over time. Two other issues before I finish. The importance of communication. And was mentioned this morning, I think it was Sergio, one of his 10 commandments was the importance of narrative. And the reality was that nationalism and republicanism in Northern Ireland won the narrative battle. They basically went out and said, we've won. Now, arguably, some of our Republican parties probably did the biggest U-turn going in terms of accepting the agreement, but they said we've won. And unionism went out and said we've lost. Why did they say that? Because they were using the constructive ambiguity to try and get more concessions out of the Blair government. But if you tell a disadvantaged, troubles impacted community over 5 to 10 years that you've lost, surprise, surprise, they end up questioning whether the agreement was any use to them. And the other aspect of communication was the internal communication. Republicanism, learning from South Africa and other places, spent a huge amount of time actually talking to their own supporters out in the country, whatever else. That didn't happen so much with other constituencies, and that was a real issue. And in relation to communication, The other one, I think, that has been problematic for us, not during the referendum period where it was actually very positive, but as we're into the implementation stages now, in the latter stages, which can be as more difficult, as Fergal says, is the impact of the media. The media tends to be confrontationalist and get the extremes, so it creates an atmosphere of antagonism. In terms of issues, I mean, some of the most difficult issues obviously were decommissioning of weapons and policing, but also the symbolic issues, which, to be honest, we probably didn't see, and we should have, we didn't see sort of coming up to bite us. Flags, emblems, cultural traditions, language, access to language. Again, something that, you know, standing back outside the situation to say, what difference does this actually make? But it actually does, and currently identity. And we say in the Good Friday Agreement, quite rightly, that, you know, that there should be even sort of handedness in terms of recognition and acknowledgement of identity. But we didn't take the time, to be honest, to unpack what that meant, particularly for the unionist community, who in some ways, and there was a question about the demographic change this morning, you know, in some ways, I think quite rightly feel a tide of history undermining their position. So we didn't look at some of those vulnerabilities, which again, I think have served to alienate possibly or certainly play into the hands of politicians that would question the Good Friday Agreement. And in terms of some of those issues, actually, one of the mechanisms we put into the Good Friday Agreement to try and broaden the politics, because our politics have become very narrowed, was the idea of a civic forum, to try and bring in civil society in terms of trying to deal with some of those wicked issues that we knew the political parties were never going to agree on. But again, you know, using the example of the Patent Commission, that you outsource them if possible to try and get a sort of a more creative approaches. But one of the first things that was done was that the Civic Forum was set up, was disbanded whenever we had the collapse of our first power sharing government, and was never reestablished. And the second thing that was done was there was a reduction in the number of elected representatives. Rather than trying to get more people in, it actually, the numbers were reduced. So it actually then centralized the power in a smaller number of political positions. So my last thought, I suppose, is, I mean, I had a list here of some of our current difficulties, but I won't depress you with mentioning those, and I think they have been covered by other speakers. I think that, you know, unless there is that sort of continuing momentum, I mean, Jonathan talked about riding the bicycle this morning. We have to maintain that riding the bicycle momentum right through the implementation stage, and to ensure that perhaps it's not just one bicycle, but there's a number of bicycles, because actually, arguably, civil society, particularly community-based organizations and women's groups, are much more vulnerable and have much less resourcing and support over the last 10 years than they did back in the 1990s, because the feeling was, oh no, we put all the energy into the elected politics. So I think we address that issue in terms of actually trying to grow the support and to reestablish support for aspects of the agreement. But I'll end on an optimistic note, because I have 3 children. And the last one, my son, was born the night after a famous bomb, the Shankill bomb, and literally was born in a hospital a stone's throw away from the Shankill, the Royal Victoria Hospital. And I remember thinking, October 1993, and I remember thinking, I must be mad to have a boy in a situation which was heading towards, you know, civil war, basically. And yet I always sort of say, of my 3 children, he's the only one that actually has celebrated all his birthdays in relative peace.
That's a sobering and positive thought to end on. Thank you very much, Avila. That was actually fascinating. We now throw the floor open for questions. one at the back. One, and then Rory.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for being here and speaking with us. During kind of the morning panel on like negotiations, it kind of struck me that negotiations exist on kind of a spectrum from broad ambiguity to like hyper specificity. And then within that, you have either a lot or a little freedom to actually implement what the agreement says. And so I'm kind of wondering, like, obviously the goal of a negotiation is to stop conflict in the moment, but kind of as people that were in charge of like the implementation, what do you think, like, where is kind of the sweet spot when it comes to specificity versus more like ambiguity to actually get an agreement able to like be negotiated in the first place?
Thank you. I'll take a few if we can from Rory next.
Just first very briefly on language, it's another anecdote. A document I mentioned this morning, the framework document, was a document produced by the governments of John Major and John Bruton to offer a broad sense of terrain for negotiations. And one of it was, language quite convoluted, and it was won a prize from the campaign for plain English as the Golden Rhubarb Award as the most incomprehensible public document of the year. And I put this to Sean McGee, the great Hajaj, who was the principal author of the Archive, and said, "We are trying to win the Belfast peace, not for literature." Anyway, look, my point is really about change, about resilience of agreements to change, change both internally and change in the wider context. And just 3 examples. Fergal mentioned, obviously, the 2 parties who principally led on the institutional aspects of the negotiations, the SDSP and the UKP, were both supplanted quite quickly afterwards. And even though, again, there was a deal between Martin McGuinness, the DUP, and the Sinn Féin, and Martin McGuinness and Paisley sat down together and decided to change the table. They too have both passed on and moved on. And now, in fact, there's a view that we are dealing with relatively insubstantial figures comparatively. So the question is, the first point is that as personnel change, you can't rely on being lucky about the people you have leading, even though leadership is so important. Second point about the external context, again, demography. One of the phenomena of Northern Ireland over the last 20 years, 30 years, has been a growing complexity in terms of community and identity. You have a growing number of people who either don't see themselves as religious, whose practice has declined, don't identify themselves as being primarily Protestant Catholic, don't identify themselves as being British or Irish in the way, or Northern Irish. They are, how big a group it is, it's there, but yet the entire peace process, not just the agreement, if you go back to some of the foundational documents of modern Irish, it's about this concept that there were 2 effectively unvarying communities, nationalist unionists, Catholic Protestants, with their own sort of fixed identities, aspirations, etc. And one of the big problems at the moment, potentially, is how do you accommodate this new reality into it. Third point, I don't need to mention it, not to jump down on the government, is that, of course, the Good Friday Agreement effectively says nothing whatever about the joint EU membership of Ireland and UK. Equally, it says nothing effectively about Northern Ireland's place in the UK single market. Why? Because nobody would have dreamt that it was necessary to say anything about either. And yet Brexit in particular has been a wrecking ball. It's a hugely complex question. It's one of the problems which remains to be resolved. And the irony is, just to finish, is that that context has changed. Weirdly enough, we would have thought that Brexit would be more convulsive for nationalism. In fact, it's turned out to be more convulsive for unionism because of the particular place of that. So my general point is, I suppose, robustness, resilience to change when either internal or situational factors change.
Sergio, please, and then Martin. And then I think what we'll do is we'll go back to the panel and give everybody a chance to respond, and then we'll probably have to close shop.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for those excellent and fascinating presentations. I learned a lot. And it's a bit scary how similar the problems are. Belfast so far away from Colombia and still. Just 2 points. First, I just encourage you to think about and discuss this great issue of how you actually measure or evaluate progress in implementation. It's a very basic, simple question, but I think it's worth putting on the table in the sense that we came up with this, as everything we did, overly complex system. So there was a clock, but we had sort of Felipe Gonzalez and Pepe Mujica with the secretariat below, and then a number of state institutions in Colombia producing their own reports, and no report is less than 200 pages, and nobody reads any of them. And so actually nobody knows what's going on. And the figures on the whole lie. First of all, because governments normally lie, and they just tell you, for example, if I may say so, Carlos, the latest UN report has a figure on hectares of land handed out, which obviously is completely false. I mean, they're just playing with numbers. But my point is not so much that, but that the logic of the agreement, one of the contributions and advancements, I would say, is what we called the territorial approach. And the idea was to really not think about various separate strands and little things and projects, but how all of those things coalesce in a particular place. And by doing so, including justice issues, including truth issues, actually reinforce each other and create positive virtuous circle logics. Now, you cannot actually capture that if you just do green, red, whatever, according to how much the government, whoever says you're implementing. You have to do something more qualitative. And I think that what you referred to, Jessica, of that UNDP report, that's a step forward. But I think we need to think more about, and I would encourage our friends at Yale to think about this, how you can actually develop more qualitative methods to actually describe progress in peace implementation. So, because this is very important, because otherwise, it's in Colombia, it's extremely hard. You're always, we're often asked, what do you think is going on? And then you point out all the things that the government has not done, which are very many. But at the same time, other things are happening. And by the way, a peace implementation is not just about implementing provisions of an agreement. It's about how reality is changing. So I got recently, which I read to Jessica and Jared at lunch, a WhatsApp from a childhood friend whom I haven't seen for decades, but I spoke to by coincidence on the telephone not so long ago, from an area, very peripheral area of Colombia, Guaviare, saying how she was amazed at how everything had changed. And everyone was saying how thanks to the peace agreement, the lives were covered, they had new projects. Nobody sees this in Colombia. Nobody knows this is going on. So that's my first one. And my second point, very brief, is this impossible issue, but true issue, which was mentioned, of political commitment and political leadership and the problem in a democracy. I mean, what happens? I mean, our case is dramatic, of course, because you get a government in that's actually against the agreement and only very slowly moves a little bit towards it, and leaves a huge hole in leadership towards reconciliation and whatever, and very difficult. But even I dare say, in the case of the Good Friday Agreement, time passes. You had a Labour government, Tony Blair, Jonathan doing this, but he also had a huge bureaucracy that was behind this, that felt implicated, and they're gone. Nobody's left there, and this lasts a long time. So how do you maintain that political commitment over time in a democracy? It strikes me as a big problem.
Thank you. I'm going to do Martin, then Jonathan, and then we really do have to close.
Yeah, so my question actually picks up on the changed circumstances theme of both Rory and Sergio, and really simply posed, it is, what do you do when one of the key parties to the agreement for domestic political reasons loses interest in the process or is indifferent to the effects of its domestic agenda on the process?
That's very, very appropriate and also succinct, which was great.
I'm happy to answer that one, and it's elect a new government. I just wanted to raise very briefly three conceptual points that I think the discussion raises about implementation. Firstly, what Avila said about the Good Friday Agreement is true. It is in the end an agreement to disagree. So the reason we're not clear about the objective is that we could not resolve the issue of whether Northern Ireland was part of United Ireland or part of United Kingdom. The Unionists thought the agreement meant it was staying part of the United Kingdom. That wasn't the case. So when you're trying to implement an agreement where you haven't agreed on the fundamental point, it is necessarily going to be quite complex politically. So I think one has to bear that in mind. And until the advent of the Boris Johnson government, that ambiguity, that agreement to disagree worked. But once you start raising the issue of identity again, you undermine the whole basis of it. The second conceptual point is one that Fergal raised, which I think is important, which is the Good Friday Agreement was very short for a reason. And I think one way of thinking about agreements like this is they are in a way a framework agreements themselves. They are agreements to be fleshed out later. That's why you get the magnum opus later when you produce it. If you think about the original Camp David with Begin and Sadat, that too was very short, 4 pages, and it was partly process, partly substance, and led to, I think one should think about agreements like that. They're not the sort of final work. They are, they're the beginning of it. And that's my third point, which is that I think it's important to think about, when I look back at the 9 years I spent trying to implement the Good Friday Agreement before we left government, I thought, oh my God, why did I waste my time doing that? And then when I really thought about it and read my diaries and looked at the papers, actually, it wasn't a waste of time at all. That's the whole point. The piece of paper doesn't really achieve anything very much apart from a nice celebration and some news headlines. The trust only gets built between people who've been killing each other once you start putting it into practice. And that, by necessity, putting it into practice is itself going to be a very difficult and unpleasant negotiation that will go on and on and on. But if you don't have that negotiation, then you don't actually solve the problem. That's why, for example, Oslo was a perfectly good agreement, lots of celebration when it was published, but no one made any effort to implement it on either side, actually, but particularly on the Israeli side. And as a result, it didn't solve the problem in whatsoever way. So I think what I do urge people, and one of the reasons why the basic agreement has a bit in it about implementation, was specifically because we agreed that implementation needed to be part of the negotiation. You need to upstream the idea of implementation and put it in the agenda for the negotiation. What I'd like to see is even more thought about that in a negotiation. So you have not just a timetable for DDR as you did in Colombia, but a timetable and who's responsible for what, as Avila said, for the political aspects of and the economic aspects of an agreement, not just for the, in a way, what you want is a very short agreement with a very long timetable.
Thank you. Okay, what I'm going to do is hand over, I think, first to Avila, and then we can go back around the table. Everybody can say their last remarks, just to very, very quickly capture those questions. I think in brief, one was, what is the sweet spot? How specific do you need to be in negotiating the peace agreement? Is there a level? How do you set up a process, implementation to be resilient? And what do you do when you're confronting either major demographic or political change in a context where you have already agreed the agreement? And the final one from Sergio was, how on earth do we actually evaluate how well we're doing in a way that's meaningful? Avila, over to you.
Thank you for those. I'll touch on some of them. I won't touch on all of them. First of all, in terms of the specific versus the more general, if you like, I mean, I think it actually comes down to the urgency of the issue and how you know, is it a sort of a benchmark crucial issue that needs to be addressed in terms of actually getting to an agreement, and then the potential of delivery. So, you know, being a combination of pragmatism and urgency in terms of how specific you need to be. I think there are other issues that can perhaps be more general, and that's where actually I think with a bit of imagination, which we didn't have, that's where something like participative democracy approaches could actually have been more useful, because it could have been taken out of the sort of the bear pit that we had at times with the aligned political parties. In terms of let's see, the issue around the robustness of change and the resilience of change. I mean, the point was made, I think it was by Sergio, you know, about the importance of people having information. I mean, one of the things that was actually done quite effectively with the Good Friday Agreement, but not afterwards, was a small civil society organization called Community Dialogue, took the agreement and turned it into everyday language. Now, actually, the agreement wasn't that complex and quite short in the first place, but still, you know, it still was being misinterpreted, you know, at local community level. And it's just like now. I mean, I spent the last couple of months going out talking to local women's groups about the protocol on Brexit. because people were taking all these sort of hard lines about it. When you asked them, they didn't have a clue what was in it, you know, and they didn't know what triggering Article 16 meant. So using, you know, making sure that you've got accessible information going out in a way that will help people have an informed understanding of the facts. And linked to that in terms of resilience, and it's problematic for us because we're over such a long period. The thing that worked in terms of selling the agreement, which with constituencies, say like the loyalist paramilitaries, was having people there that had political analysis, that were good messengers, and that could actually know how to communicate a message. Now we've lost some of those in terms of people like Davy Irvine dying and so forth, but actually trying to identify those people in your different stakeholder groups is essential in terms of not allowing a sort of general sort of sense of misunderstanding or alternate facts that are being put forward. There was a point made about others and people sort of with the growing number to an extent that was mentioned this morning in terms of not seeing themselves as the sort of binary, a unionist or Republican nationalist. And that is a challenge for the agreement, because obviously our governance institutions is based on actually, you know, denoting yourself as one or other, basically. And what I think I would say about that, my organization did some polling about 2 years ago, and actually the other group came up at about 17%, mainly under 35, mainly interested in things like LGBT rights, you know, reproductive rights, socioeconomic rights. However, I still think, you know, identity is not unitary. It is intersectionality. And, you know, that's not to say that people who will actually sort of say that's what they're interested in won't, when it comes to, say, a referendum on the border, take a line going back to national identity. And I think, yes, so perhaps the last point I'll make is in terms of the agreement itself. I mean, I think, you know, one of the things that we really need to safeguard are the values that are within that agreement. And I think if we can actually get, you know, and there are very clear value statements. In fact, I pulled them out the paper the other day. It was about 3 pages long. If you can actually build on that value statement and get discussion around those, rather than perhaps whether you know, have an Irish Language Act or not, well, then I think it probably can possibly broaden the discussion, particularly if you can link those value statements to the type of society that people want to live in, and then almost work back and sort of say, well, what's the constitutional entity that will actually deliver that society?
Thank you very much indeed. I've really enjoyed this session. I don't want it to end, but I hear it has to. So if I can encourage people just to be brief. Thanks.
I'll be very brief. And look, I think I'd agree with Jonathan about the Good Friday Agreement. It is short, but it's all there. You know, the values, the principles, the constitutional compromises, and then the framework, the guidance for implementation. And I sense, not I wasn't there, but I sense anything more detailed could have crashed the bus at that moment. So therefore, certainly in an Northern Ireland context, I think it was sufficient unto the day, and probably as much as could be achieved. And it was very important to get that agreement and then drive it on and implement it. In terms of leadership, I mean, it was an extraordinary generation. Think of John Hume, Seamus Mallon, you know, David Trimble, Adams McGuinness, David Irvine. You don't have to agree with any of them or all of them, but they were an extraordinary generation that showed genuine leadership and took risks. But we judge them now at the end of their days. And, you know, even in 1998, many of them were experienced campaigners who've been around. And I think we have to give the current generation a bit of time to grow into that. You know, these are hard acts to follow, and they have to step up. But, you know, don't judge them by, you know, John Hume, Seamus Mallon, Martin McGuinness, you know, at their zenith, at their peak. Because I think a point we do find in peace process, and this is not just Northern Ireland, but actually participation in the process changes the participants. You know, they grow and develop and evolve as that process goes on, as they get more involved. So I think let's give current leadership a bit of leeway in terms of following on, but they have to step up to the shoes. I mean, that's undoubtedly the case. In terms of review, I think you have a process there that's aiming to change politics. Therefore, it has to allow for political change. The Good Friday Agreement had review mechanisms in place under the various strands. Those review mechanisms were used. They were used to good effect in the St. Andrews Agreement. It certainly allowed the DUP to come on board. So I think any peace agreement has to have some flexibility within it, while absolutely holding hard and fast to the values and principles that are, the very underpinning of the agreement, which is the case in the Good Friday Agreement. But tweaking, amending, revising elements, to reflect changing politics seems to be perfectly sensible and reasonable, and was used to good effect in the peace process itself. They're the key elements. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Fergal. Jessica.
Yes, on the question of the specificity of the agreement, one of the issues of the Colombia agreement, in my opinion, right, in the opinion of many who were involved in the implementation, was that there was an all-encompassing agreement. On the one hand, of course, it recognizes the multidimensionality and the integrality in the issues that are connected. But on the other hand, it tries to solve all the problems of the country through this peace agreement. That made it that makes it actually difficult, and it's part of the difficulty not only of the implementation, which that's why it will take 15 years or more, but it also makes it difficult to measure. But in my opinion, another thing that makes it difficult is for people to understand exactly what was agreed and what were the commitments. And I think there's an enormous effort still to be done, even at 5 years, to educate people. For instance, the peace science or art industry appreciates enormously what was done as an innovation for the existence of the special jurisdiction for peace, but this is difficult for the people to understand. So in my opinion, there's a lot more of education and pedagogy that needs to happen, because otherwise, for instance, referring to the same perception of the people appreciate this, but they still ask for, or they still have high expectations for very strong penalties for FARC, for instance. And that's because, in my opinion, people just don't understand exactly what was agreed in terms of the transitional justice, right? So that's a little bit of the balance there.
Thank you so much, Jessica. To Carlos, finally.
Thank you. Again, I mean, there's no one size fits all at the end. You have a framework agreement, and then you have to develop a lot of work afterwards. In the 300 pages agreement in Colombia, probably you don't need to do that. But the importance is the mechanisms that you have in order to solve the problems through a constant dialogue between the parties. So that's why it's important. That doesn't close the door necessarily to having a review of certain provisions when a new actor comes and is not too convinced for doing that. When I arrived, President Duque flagged 3 areas that he wanted to reform the agreement about political, the link between kidnapping and drug trafficking with the rebellion crime, that was linked in this process as such. But there were red lines. I said, look, if this is for the future and not for this agreement, it's fine. If you want to negotiate this agreement for the UN, it's fine, as long as you have the other party sit down at the table, which was not something that he was considering at that time. At the end, nothing happened, but you shouldn't necessarily close the door, but you have certain red lines that you have to make sure that they are observed. Going forward, and for an issue that was mentioned before, which is the ELN, probably the only chance for the government to get an agreement done in the last few months that the government had or has was something probably more a framework agreement in order to move forward. And that's probably what the president or the government had in mind when we were exploring some options. But the problem is that the counterpart had completely a different view on how a process of this nature should be conducted. So I'll leave it there.
Fergal's going to thank you very much, Carlos. Fergal has one more thing.
One just very, very final point, and it's for the students here. I was in St. Andrews in 2006, And a colleague of mine, a young colleague, had studied in Queen's University. He had done comparative politics, negotiation processes, and he was shocked and appalled at the messy, chaotic nature of the negotiations. It bore no relation to what he had learned at Queen's or in university. But both he and I then were in the talks for the new decade, new approach in 2019, 2020, and we didn't fear the chaos and anarchy anymore. We saw that's part of the process. So likewise, if you're involved in future processes, don't be afraid of the chaos. It's part of it.
Okay, can we thank the really excellent panelists for a great discussion?